Hey everybody, welcome to the Renaissance Woodworker. I am your host, Shannon Rogers, and I'm doing another Q&A. I usually do these live, but technology's been bugging me lately. So I've been taking questions via my Patreon campaign. That's at patreon.com/Renaissance Woodworker, and trying to answer them here in hopefully a weekly, semi-weekly basis. So here again, I appreciate those who sponsor the show. Happy to answer your questions. Happy to even dedicate a show to a specific technique or question or something that's on your mind. So as always, thank you patrons for supporting the show. And this week I'm going to talk about dealing with thin stock, specifically planing stock that's like thinner than 1/4 of an inch. I want to talk a little bit about bevel angles as it relates to sharpening and the sharpness, if that's a word, of the blade based upon the bevel angle. And then finally, I want to talk about splines and miters, stiffening miters, both a flat frame miter and a wider kind of case miter, and how we can go about stiffening those, strengthening those using hand tool techniques. So let's get started. I had a question from Bob about planing thin stock. For most part, if you're dealing with stock that's 1/4 inch or thicker, I just recommend the same thing I use for thick stock, just a plain old planing stop that's stuck here in my bench. Once things start to get thinner though, the problem is the wood itself becomes very flexible. And if you push it up against a stop, a bench dog or something, first of all, that dog has to be lower than the thickness of the stock. This stock is like 3/32 of an inch thick. But because it's so flexible, as I plane, a lot of times you'll find it bowing up or even bowing down on you. The force of the plane will cause that bend, which can often be very difficult to get a continuous shaving. The other thing that I've used over the years is something I call the invisible vise. In fact, I've got a video here on this channel called the invisible vise, where I just use double stick tape. Tape it down to the bench, and then I don't have to there's nothing in the way that would be holding that down. Well, another method that works really, really well, especially if you have a piece of stock that's longer than you actually need, you can use a holdfast that won't be in the way. So I'll take the holdfast and just grab the back of my stock. And here again, if say I only need this much of it, this works fine, because now as I plane, the holdfast is holding on to the work, but this force is actually kind of stretching and flattening out any bending and cupping that can occur under the flex of the thin stock. And I can flatten this out very easily, and things are not budging. And by skewing it, I can get pretty close to the holdfast. I had a pencil line drawn right here, and I'm removing that pencil line about 1.5 inches from the point of the holdfast. And this works great. I can take this down to final thickness. If, say, you needed the whole piece and maybe didn't have the foresight to make it a little bit longer than necessary, you could actually flip it around, grab the stock that you've already thicknessed, and come back and plane the rest, but recognize you will be working against the grain now. But if you've got a really, really fine set cut and you skew your blade really heavily, you can sometimes get away with that, especially in more agreeable stock like I've got with this cherry. But say that's not an option, you could use a bench dog. And the beauty of these bench dogs is they can be set quite low in the top so that they fall below the thickness of the stock. And as I said, this is a pretty extreme example, being that this is like 3/32 of an inch thick stock. But this was the area that I had put under the holdfast at first. Now, if I come back and start back here, I am going to get this bowing up on me. But since I've already planed all this material up to right about here, I can now come back and just plane that last part. And because I've got the toe of the plane, so much of it's covering up the wood, it's pressing down, it's preventing any of that bowing you can see or you can create. And I can now plane the rest of the stock down so I've got one cohesive surface. But here again, one of the best ways you can deal with this is just to leave your stock longer, grab it in the back and plane what's left, and then saw off the part that you didn't thickness. Makes things so much easier than having to worry about flipping things around and switching grain direction and all that. In fact, that's a great tip in general. Anytime you're cutting something like across the grain, say you're cutting a dado, if you leave that stock a little bit wider, you don't have to worry about blowout on the far side of that dado, because once the dado's cut, I can come back joint the edge and remove any blowout. In fact, we're going to see that tip come up again when I put a spline in a wide miter. So we now know how to plane the really thin material, which here again, this would be really helpful for creating those splines in the wide miters. We'll get to that in just a bit. Next, I had a question from Tom about the bevel angle and how it relates to the keenness or the sharpness of the blade. He was asking how, if I lower the angle, is that going to reduce the durability? Whereas if I steepen the angle, will it increase the durability? I say yes to both of those, but the real question is, does it actually lower the sharpness of the blade? Now, technically, sharp is the perfect intersection of two geometric planes. So they can intersect at 50 degrees, 90 degrees. That perfect intersection will still be sharp. If you don't believe me, joint an edge of a board at 90 degrees and run your finger along that freshly jointed edge and watch the blood flow. That's a 90-degree corner and it is sharp enough to draw blood. Now, because it's a really steep angle, because there's so much material there, it is quite durable. The lower you make that angle down to 25, 20, 17 degrees, there's very thin steel out at the point, and that's where the durability issue comes into play. But I submit that 25 degrees is a perfectly durable angle. The reason that Tom brings this up is he was concerned about, should I be sharpening my chisels, some of my plane blades, to a higher angle than 25 degrees. Now, you can make all kinds of cases for different types of steel, you know, the more durable modern steels, or even like the powdered metal stuff, the PMV11 things that Veritas has. Maybe you can make a case for that you can go with an even lower angle and still end up with a durable edge because you've got a little bit of steel, but an especially hard level of steel. With that extreme hardness, though, can come brittleness. That's a word, right? Brittleness. And if you find that you are using that lower angle edge or really, really hard steel and you're pounding on it with a mallet, you will still find that that edge will be prone to fracture regardless of the bevel angle. I have every single one of my planes, molding planes, bench planes, joinery planes, sharpened at 25 degrees. It's been a good all-around angle for me. My chisels are sharpened at 25 degrees, with the exception of my English-style pig sticker mortise chisels, where I have a primary bevel down at 25 degrees, but then I've got a secondary bevel. It's not a micro bevel, it's a secondary bevel because it's quite wide. It's about 1/8 of an inch wide. That secondary bevel is sharpened at 35, or sometimes a little bit higher, depending on the mood I'm in as I'm sharpening. That higher angle puts more steel out to the tip and it makes it more durable to the pounding as I drive a mortise. But the primary bevel scaled back to 25 gives me a steeper angle and more clearance. So as I'm levering out chips inside the mortise, that lower angle gives me a lot more room to move that waste into. But if I used a 25 degree single bevel all the way down, I would find that edge folding on me a lot because that is a tool where I'm using a mallet on it quite a bit. My bench chisels are at 25 degrees, but my paring chisels, I've got a lot of these long bladed paring chisels. In fact, this whole back row of my cabinet are these long chisels. These are sharpened at 20 degrees. It's a much, much lower angle. These never get hit with a mallet. This is all fine work. As I'm truing up the edge of a joint, I use this one a lot for truing up the sockets of sliding dovetails. It's very light work, hand pressure only, and I don't have to worry about the durability of the edge. I don't have to worry about it crumpling on me because it's a lower angle. But because it's a lower angle, it also decreases the amount of force required to draw up a shaving, to cut with it, because it's really, really fine. It's going to slip into that wood a lot easier. It is a balancing act that you do need to play, and some of you may find that you want your bench chisels to be set to maybe a higher 30-degree angle. These Lee Nielsen's, I'm pretty sure were at 30 when I bought them. Over the last decade or so, I've just been lowering that angle down to 25 degrees because I like how that works. If you find that you're folding the edges on your lower angles, I want to ask you, how hard are you hitting your chisels with a mallet? If you are using bench chisels to chop a mortise, perfectly acceptable, but maybe don't hit it so hard. Even with my pig stick or mortise chisels, I find that I'm not hitting very hard at all. I tend to use a heavier mallet for mortises, but just a single tap is all I'm doing. I'm not walloping on the thing because it's still a wedge. It doesn't matter the keenness of that edge or how steep that bevel is, it's still a wedge. And in fact, the steeper the bevel, the greater that wedging action and the faster that chisel is going to stick in the wood and run out of room in which to wedge waste into. Cutting or chopping a mortise is all about removing the waste and wedging out the waste. We have this stout blade here mainly to allow us to lever out the chisels. If I try to do that with this chisel will actually flex. I can feel it flexing because it's quite narrow. This stoutness is for that lever action, and the wedge, really, it's 1 or 2 hits with a mallet and that wedge is as deep as it's gonna go. You could probably hit it 2, 3 more times and it might go another 1/16, maybe another 1/8 of an inch deep into the wood. But if you've ever done that and you found the chisel frozen and you have to rock the sucker back and forth in order to pull it free, and then sometimes it comes up in your face because it comes free all of a sudden, you've driven that chisel too deep. And you've put a lot more stress on that chisel than that lower bevel angle can take. So maybe you've sharpened to a higher angle because you folded a chisel edge before while chopping a mortise. I urge you to not chop so hard. First, not walloping so hard with a mallet, but also just focus on 1, maybe 2 hits at most. And you'll find that you're able to lever out the waste very easily. And what really causes the problems, what causes the constriction on the wedge, is the excess weights that gets trapped inside that mortise. The rest of the time, chopping dovetails, really, you're not going deep and you don't need to hit it really hard. In fact, the harder you hit it, probably the more chances are you're going to deform your baseline. And rarely are we going to be so abusive to our tools. This is mainly chisels you're talking about. Hand planes, you're not going to be that abusive on these things. And if you do find you're curling the edges, don't look at the bevel angle, look in the mirror, because that's probably what's causing the problem. Strengthening miters can be done quite easily, whether it's a 90-degree miter like this or whatever the heck angle this is that I just glued up. The idea is you want to create a saw kerf and then plug it with a bit of spline material. And I've already shown how you can plane down thin material. The easiest way is to make 2 saw cuts. Imagine you're sawing out the female part of a bridle or the reverse of a tenon. You saw a cut on either side of that, use a chisel to chop out what's in between. The key is that you have a chisel that matches or is narrower than the spline you're trying to put in there. If the spline is so thin you don't have a chisel that goes in, it can be really difficult to remove the material in between your saw cuts. Or you can use a single saw kerf, something like a dovetail saw with a very finely set, if not no set saw, sink that single kerf and drop a piece of veneer in. Now, commercial veneer might be really, really thin. You might have to come up with shop sawn veneer, but there again, you can plane that veneer down to fit. So the key obviously is to create your miter and then glue up the miter so that it is nice and firmly together and I can saw across both joints at the same time. I will first mark kind of a rough baseline on here. I'm just going to go 1 inch in either direction. That sounds about right. Probably would go much deeper than that, and let's just see how we do with the dovetail saw and a single kerf. I can tell you right now, I've got this angle wrong. So again, just like sawing a tenon cheek, you saw down a line on each face, stopping at the baseline. Now let's see, here's some commercial walnut veneer. And yeah, that's gonna be a good friction fit. Now imagine throwing a little glue on that sucker. And that's gonna get even stronger. Now it's a little hard to see in the teak side. It's a little bit easier to see on the pine side of the joint, but I have a single saw cut that is now filled with walnut. If I did that 3 times, maybe 4 times across this narrow piece, you're gonna really get a cool look, and you're also gonna get quite a bit of strength. Now I only went 1 inch deep here, which means the spline's only running across there. I would probably wanna go down much, much further. The idea being that you're filling as much of this miter joint with that long grain texture of the veneer. And even this super thin commercial 1/10 of an inch thickness veneer is going to work just fine. The alternative would be creating a cut that is the width of your chisel. And what I would do is use a mortise gauge set to the width of my chisel and saw it out from there. I'm doing this very quickly and roughly and hoping that I'm accurate enough. You do want to try to chop from both sides. I don't want to unnecessarily blow out the other side of this joint. It might be a little bit too wide in my chopping here. We'll just see. I want to create something that I can run the chisel across and it touches baseline to baseline. And even if you wanted to kind of undercut it slightly, the idea is that you've got that chisel touching on both lines. Now, let's see if I, in my haste, chopped it out too narrow, or too wide rather. Yeah, it's a little wide. Yeah, you can see it's a little loose there. But that's what having some other stock around, oh, look at that, that actually fits. Here again, if I had stock that was too thick, you know, if I had something like this, it was too thick, we know how to plane that down. You want a good kind of slip friction fit, but the glue will swell that up and make it fit really, really tightly. But here again, be relatively easy to take thicker stocks like this and plane it down to fit. And that's going to provide a lot of strength in it because now I've got a much thicker bit of long grain that runs across. But I urge you to consider the veneer thing. You saw how quick and easy that was? I could very easily, in the same amount of time it took to chop this out, sink 2, 3 more kerfs, slide the veneer in, and you're going to get a really strong joint. So what about a wider miter, like a box side miter, or even something wider, like a case side miter? Well, this is not only going to want to require some stiffening, but more importantly, I think it's really integral for assembly and glue up. A flat miter, you can wrap tape around it, and they don't really have to undergo that much pressure under clamping, whereas if I got to clamp together 4 sides of a wide case, it's really difficult to do when you've just got the miter contact. Having an integral spline registers it together almost like you were using dominoes or biscuits that will keep that miter from slipping past one another as you put clamps on it. So certainly it strengthens it. You could use splines across the grain like we showed with that flat miter, or you can use an inline spline. If anybody knows, if there's an actual name for the difference there, if I put a spline along the grain or if I put a spline across the grain, is it still called a spline? I don't know. I don't know if there's a specific name for that. But what I'm going to do is show you how I use hand tools to cut that groove along the grain, across the miter itself. And what this does is it closes up the miter joint with no visible spline or no visible key. It hides the whole thing. Of course, if you want to talk about a hidden miter joint, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up this guy, the fully blind dovetail. This is, first of all, it's cool because the whole thing goes together and it makes the joint, you know, look like just a plain old miter, but it also gives you that registration that once I assemble this, I don't have to worry about clamping. I can clamp just like you would a typical through dovetail because that completely locks itself together and it makes that registration a lot easier. Also, cut properly, this is a self-squaring joint. But that can be a lot more work to cut these so they all align on a joint like this over the course of a dovetail case, which is why I want to show you how to make that miter spline. So here are my test pieces. I've got a 45-degree angle here, and all I did was just roughly saw this, and then I have a 45-degree shooting board that I use just to refine that angle and bring it in so that I've got a good mate here between the two of them. That's the first part, right? Cutting the 45, and you know, if you're using a table saw, things will get a lot easier. Using a shooting board, it's just as easy. Just saw out the bulk of the way so you're not spending a whole bunch of time with the shooting board trying to refine a 20-degree angle into a 45-degree angle. And since I know people are going to ask, this is my wide miter shooting board. This is actually something that I built as an applied project in semester 2 of the hand tool school. And it allows you to put the board flat and your plane rides in this chute, rides up against this top board and it's captured in the chute. And it just rides back and forth, cutting that 45-degree angle. It's really nice because I've got I think it's about an 18-inch width here, so I could put really large case sides in here and shoot that. I find it's a lot easier than that traditional donkey's ear that holds the board up, and you have to have a little bit more support there. This is really well supported, and it makes it just super easy to cut these. So what I want to do is plow a groove across this face, actually across both faces, that perfectly lines up so that when I stick a spline in there, the joint comes together. Well, that shouldn't be too hard if you have a plow plane, right? We can set the fence on the plow plane, which will allow us to precisely position the blade in the center of this. The problem is we've got this weird wonky angle. Well, what we know is that this fence works on a 90-degree face to where the blade cuts. What we also know is that these two angles, when come together, creates 90 degrees. So if I were to put this fence against this edge, I'm going to cut a groove in the 90-degree face. So if we reverse the boards and put them back to back so the long point of the miter is together, this is now a 90-degree angle. And when I put my fence against one face, I'm perfectly lined up to cut a groove straight into the miter on the opposite face. So I am going to clamp these together in my vise. The other thing I'm going to say here is you don't need a wide groove. I've got one of my narrowest plow plane blades in here, and normally I just have my 1/4-inch blade in here. That's what I use for like drawer box grooves and such. But I specifically have put in, this is an 1/8-inch wide blade. There's no reason to try to plow out a huge hunk of material here when an 1/8-inch spline is going to do just fine. I can, however, cut it pretty deep. So I'm going to drop, actually I'm going to go ahead and move my depth stop up so that I'm cutting probably close to 3/8 of an inch deep. So if I were to run 3/8 of an inch into this face, I'm not going to intersect the other side. That is one thing I want to double check, but that extra projection is just going to give me a more glue surface. Just like the longer you make a tenon, the stronger that tenon will be. So I now can drop my fence onto one face, and I just want to eyeball this so that I'm centered or somewhat inboard of center. If I go out near the tip, I have less material. If I go right in the center, that's fine, but if I go a little bit towards the heel of the miter, this is the toe, this is the heel. If I go towards the heel of the miter, I've got even more stock, even more thickness behind me to allow me to plow this groove. As I plow this groove, first of all, I'm going cross grain. I very likely am going to spelch or blow out that back corner. So if I've made this wider, 1/2 an inch wider than what I need, I can very easily spelch that corner and come back and clean it up. Or you can maybe not worry about it that much. Like any groove, I won't start on the far side and try to go all the way across. I will start on the far side and just work my way back slowly. Now the other thing is I want to set this to take a light cut. There's no reason to be taking a heavy cut, especially right now as I'm just trying to lay out the extents of this groove. So really light shavings and stepping back little by little allows me to really be certain that I'm getting that groove sunk properly. And that lighter cut is not going to really tear out the surface that much. Now, I'm using pine. It's somewhat agreeable, but it's also pretty soft. I actually would probably have more luck doing something like this in a harder hardwood. But once you get that started, if you really are nervous about going cross grain, first of all, step back and sharpen your blade. But what I've done is I've started this cut, so I could very easily use this cut as my guide. I can drop a saw in here and actually saw it to the rest of my depth. Then I can come back and continue to plane, but with the cross grain already sawn, you'll find that the waste is just going to pop out without a problem. Now the one thing I want to do, I've got this sunk about 1/8 of an inch. What I'm going to do, let me step in front of the camera here real quick. While I've still got this whole thing set up and while everything is even, I want to go ahead and start the other side. Don't touch anything on the fence, but there's always a possibility as I go deeper and deeper, I'm going to be exerting more and more force on this board. And if I shift these two boards, if they slide past one another, I'm going to change the location a little bit. And I really don't want to do that. I want to make sure I've locked in the location of these grooves before I shift the boards. So just switching to the other side and planing the groove will get that locked into place. So now, if these boards shift, I know how to position. I can drop the blade in and I can loosen my fence, move everything back into place in order to get it lined up again. I still want them side by side because I've got this fence running against it, but honestly, once I now have the groove sunk to this particular depth, I could actually remove the fence entirely because the plane is going to run in the groove that I've created. The plane is now on autopilot and I'm just trying to take it to my final depth. Now the one thing I will always say about these planes is never trust the depth stops. They can be easily fooled. So I will keep planing and then periodically check where my depth stop is. I think I'm about there. And then just use a good old-fashioned ruler and double check my depth. Yeah, there we go. Now I'll just finish the other side. Now I need to create a spline that fits in that groove. Just out of curiosity. Oh, you got to be kidding me. That appears to be the right thickness already. Well, that's convenient. That was not my intention, I can tell you that. We just got lucky. But if we have a spline that's this thick and it doesn't fit it, well, we already know how to thicken this down to the appropriate thickness. I just showed you that before. Moreover, you can see I've got stock here that's plenty long enough so I can grab it with the holdfast in the back, plane this part down, saw off the excess, and be able to use that as my spline. The other thing I'll say is if you're sizing this spline, it's not a bad idea to take 1 or 2 extra passes with the plane to get it so that you can slip it together without too much effort, because once I apply glue to this, especially thin stock like this, that sucker is going to swell up and it's going to make things really tight. And if I have to kind of hammer this in, you might find that the swelling of this groove can actually throw the angle of the miter off. So be very cautious there. I'm just going to use my back saw because it's here. This is so thin. It's going to cut really fast, and it doesn't have to be, I don't have to have a backless saw to make this cut all the way through. So there we go. So now this spline is going to be too wide for what I need. It's almost a 1/16 too wide. One thing about planing small, narrow stock like this is it planes very fast. So it's only going to take me a couple of seconds to hit my line. And that should do it. So now I can slip that spline in. And that closes up the fit. And you can see there's the integral spline. And what I like about this is it registers, you see that miter registered on the edge, and that glue, as I said, is going to swell things up a little bit and make for a really nice joint that I can now, if I've completed the circuit, if I got 4 sides to this box, it's going to allow me to clamp it like I would a normal box, and that spline will prevent the miter from slipping back and forth. So there we are. There is an integral spline and miter joint. Good selection of topics, and actually several of them are related to one another when it comes to planing thin stock and creating those splines. I hope that helps you guys. Thank you for asking those questions. And as always, keep the questions coming. I want to continue doing these videos, and if I've got good questions, it makes them a lot easier. Best way to ask those questions is to become a Patreon of this show, patreon.com/renaissancewoodworker.